Senator Harlan Cross leaned back at the congressional charity dinner and fixed his eyes on the black waitress approaching with a pitcher of water. "She can't serve my table," he announced, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Get me someone more suitable." His donors laughed, but what the senator didn't know was that Tessa Whitfield was not just a catering worker. She was a third-year law student tracing his offshore shell companies for months. That night, from a cramped kitchen hallway, she uploaded a cache of encrypted documents. By sunrise, his $14.7 million Caribbean secret was on every front page. What happened next would topple a career before the breakfast news cycle was over. Don't go anywhere. Tessa Whitfield wasn't just a waitress. She was a third-year law student who'd spent 5 months tracing Senator Cross's offshore fortune. The night he humiliated her, she was holding 14.7 million reasons to end his career. But the leak didn't start that night. It began 5 months earlier, with a single suspicious transaction on a public disclosure form that nobody else noticed. The transaction that started it all was a single-line item buried on page 43 of Senator Cross's campaign finance disclosure. A $2,000 consulting fee paid to a company called North Star Holdings, registered in a postal box in Wilmington, Delaware. Tessa Whitfield had been interning at the watchdog group Citizens for Financial Integrity for exactly 3 months when she flagged it. Her job was to cross-reference public filings against offshore registries, and North Star didn't appear in any domestic business database. That was the first red flag. She requested the company's incorporation documents from the Delaware Division of Corporations. The listed director was another shell company, this one based in the Cayman Islands. That linked to a trust in the British Virgin Islands. That trust was managed by a law firm in Miami that specialized in what they called asset protection strategies for high-net-worth individuals. Tessa stayed late after her shifts at the catering company, hunched over a laptop in the law library, tracing a spiderweb of 37 entities across 11 jurisdictions. Most interns would have stopped at the first dead end. Tessa didn't. She understood something about money and power that you learn when you work 2 jobs to cover tuition while sitting next to classmates who summer in the Hamptons. The messier a financial trail looks, the harder someone worked to hide it. By the 3rd month, she had connected North Star to a real estate holding company in Panama, which owned a beachfront villa assessed at $4.3 million, which had been purchased the same year Senator Cross co-sponsored a bill benefiting the villa's developer. The developer had donated exactly $0 to Cross's campaign. The donations had come through a super PAC, and the super PAC's primary donor was yet another shell company in the same Cayman Islands network. The circle closed with the cold efficiency of a Swiss watch. Tessa compiled everything into an encrypted folder: incorporation records, wire transfer receipts, property deeds, internal emails from the Miami law firm that had been accidentally CC'd to a reporter, and then deleted from the public record, though not before Tessa archived them. The total value of the hidden assets kept climbing. 2 million here, 5 million there, until the spreadsheet bottom line read $14.7 million. All controlled by a senator who campaigned on fiscal responsibility and working-class values. But knowing a secret and proving it are 2 different things. Going public would require a journalist with the legal backing to verify every document and the nerve to publish against a sitting senator's legal threats. Tessa didn't know anyone like that. Not yet. Then the catering company posted the schedule for the congressional charity dinner. Table assignments had the senator seated directly in Tessa's section. She considered calling in sick. Instead, she pressed her waitress uniform, packed her apron, and made a quiet decision. She would serve his table, keep her head down, and carry the encrypted files on a thumb drive in her pocket just in case. The files were a dead weight against her thigh all evening. Senator Harlan Cross arrived with his entourage at 7:15, shaking hands and laughing that polished, Capitol Hill laugh. When Tessa approached with the water pitcher, he didn't even look at her face. He just leaned back, smiled at his donors, and said the words that would detonate a career that had survived 6 terms and 2 federal investigations. The words hung in the air like smoke in a room with no windows. 400 people had turned to look, and most of them were still laughing. Tessa Whitfield set the water pitcher down on the table with the kind of deliberate stillness that comes not from calm, but from the precise control that anger requires. She looked at the senator for a full 2 seconds, long enough that his smile flickered. Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen, each step measured, the sound of her flats on the marble floor quieter than the laughter still dying out behind her. In the cramped kitchen hallway, pressed against a wall of stacked chairs and industrial heating trays, she pulled her phone from her apron pocket. Her hands did not shake. She navigated to a messaging app she had installed 5 months earlier, the one with end-to-end encryption that the watchdog group used for field communications. She opened a thread with a contact saved only as MW and typed 3 words. "It's time. Go." Attached to the message was a compressed archive of 34 documents, every incorporation record, every wire transfer confirmation, every time-stamped email from the Miami law firm. She pressed send. The file uploaded in 8 seconds. Upstairs, Senator Cross was still shaking his head, performing for the table. "You can't get good help anymore," he said. Someone snapped a photo of him with a cigar. The photo would appear in the news the next morning, captioned not with his name, but with the headline that would define his legacy. Marcus Webb was a senior investigative reporter at the Washington Ledger, and he had been sitting on a bar stool at a dive in Adams Morgan when Tessa's message arrived. He read the 3 words, opened the files, and ordered a double espresso. He flagged the bartender for his tab and walked 6 blocks to the newsroom in the kind of focused silence that colleagues had learned to recognize. He spent 3 hours verifying what he could against public records, then called the paper's general counsel at home. "I need a legal review on a package," he said. "Senator Cross, offshore accounts. I've got source documents, chain of custody, the works." The attorney asked only one question: "How solid?" Webb said, "Solid enough that if we don't run it, someone else will by morning." The story went live on the Ledger's website at 2:12 a.m. Eastern. The headline read, "Senator Harlan Cross concealed $14.7 million in undisclosed Caribbean accounts, documents show." The article included PDF links to incorporation records in Panama, a Cayman Islands trust structure, and emails from a Miami law firm discussing Senator C's sensitivity to public exposure. None of the documents were redacted. By 2:45, the wire services had picked it up. By 3 a.m., cable news had cut into overnight programming with breaking news banners. The senator was asleep in his Georgetown townhouse when his chief of staff broke down the door with a spare key. She had called 6 times. His phone was on silent. She found him in a silk robe, blinking at his own name on the television screen. The words "Federal Ethics Investigation" were already scrolling across the bottom third of the screen. "Harlan," she said, "they've got everything." He didn't answer. He just stood there, watching his career implode from a distance, like a man watching a building burn down, and already calculating what the insurance would cover. What the documents revealed went far deeper than hidden money. The $14.7 million wasn't just a slush fund. It was the proceeds of a stock trade that Cross had made the same week his banking committee killed a regulatory bill that would have exposed insider dealing. The trade had been executed through a shell company that Cross had sworn he had no connection to under oath during a prior ethics inquiry. That was perjury. That was federal charges. The Miami law firm had a partner who, in a recorded phone call Tessa had also obtained, referred to Cross as the client who thinks he's untouchable because he writes the rules. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who'd watched him campaign on restoring integrity to Washington. By 6 a.m., Cross's campaign manager resigned. By 7, a spokesperson for the Senate Ethics Committee announced they were opening a preliminary investigation and that the senator had been asked to preserve all relevant records. By 8, the chairman of Cross's own party called for him to suspend his campaign. The donor network that had propped him up for decades went silent, phones unanswered, email inboxes suddenly full. But the pivot that reframed everything came at 9:15, when a junior analyst at Citizens for Financial Integrity ran Tessa's original spreadsheet against a separate database of campaign contributions and found something that made her blood run cold. The same shell network that hid Cross's fortune had also funneled at least $2 million into a super PAC supporting 3 other senators, all of whom had co-sponsored bills benefiting the same Panamanian developer. Tessa had aimed at one man. She had hit a system. She was standing in the kitchen of her apartment, still in her waitress uniform from the night before, when her phone buzzed with a call from a blocked number. She answered. The voice on the other end was male, calm, and carried the particular weight of someone who doesn't need to introduce himself. "Ms. Whitfield," he said, "you've made quite an impression. I'd like to talk to you about what happens next before the people you've just exposed decide what happens next for you." The line went dead. Tessa looked at her phone. She didn't know who had called. She would find out within 48 hours, and what she would learn would make the 14.7 million look like pocket change. The 48 hours started with a single text message that arrived at 10 that night from a number Tessa didn't recognize. It contained an address in Northeast Washington, a park bench near the reflecting pool at the National Arboretum, and 2 words: "Come alone." She didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table in her waitress uniform, now cold and stiff from the night before, and stared at the screen of her laptop where the Ledger article was still dominating every news aggregation site. Her thumb drive was still in her apron pocket. She could feel its shape pressing against her thigh, a small rectangle of plastic that had already rewritten the political calendar. At dawn, she called Kesha Monroe, the only person at the watchdog group who knew about the full scope of the leak. Kesha picked up on the first ring. "I just got a message too," Kesha said. "Same block of numbers. Someone's very interested in who you are." Tessa asked the question she'd been avoiding. Is this the kind of interest that ends with a job offer, or the kind that ends with a body bag? Kesha paused. "That's what we need to find out." The Arboretum was empty when Tessa arrived at 6:45, the winter sky still dark except for a thin smear of orange on the horizon. She sat on the designated bench and waited. At exactly 7, a man in a gray overcoat and plain black baseball cap walked up from the direction of the Asian garden. He sat down beside her without looking at her. He was in his late 60s, she guessed, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades of operating in places where the weather wasn't the only thing that could kill you. He introduced himself as Frank Delaney, retired Deputy Director of the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. He spoke in the unhurried cadence of a man who had read about 40,000 suspicious activity reports and knew exactly how long it took for a money trail to go cold. "You did good work, Ms. Whitfield," he said, "but you've stepped into something that makes Senator Cross look like the warm-up act. The 14.7 million, that's the decoy. It was designed to be found." Tessa felt the cold metal of the park bench seep through her coat. Designed by who? Delaney turned to look at her for the first time. By the people who have been using Senator Cross as a front man for 15 years. They're not in the Cayman Islands. They're in Moscow, and they've been laundering influence through 3 Senate committees since 2009. What Delaney laid out over the next 30 minutes changed the gravity of everything. The shell network Tessa had uncovered wasn't just a tax evasion scheme. It was a node in a global money laundering infrastructure that funneled foreign capital into U.S. elections through a chain of nonprofits, super PACs, and dark money groups so layered that even the IRS had lost the thread. Cross was the public face, the vote on the floor, but the real operators were half a dozen men in Moscow and one senior partner at the Miami law firm who had been a Soviet intelligence asset in the late 80s, turned American, and never stopped serving his original handlers. Delaney had the receipts, intercepted wire transfers, a classified FinCEN memo that had been buried by political appointees, and a forensic audit of the Miami firm's internal billing codes that showed large, recurring payments marked only as Project Clear Sky. Tessa's mind raced back through all the documents she'd collected. She remembered one email from the Miami partner that had seemed odd at the time, a reference to the elevation of the senator's visibility that she'd assumed meant publicity. Now she understood. They were grooming him, placing him on the committees where his votes would be worth the most, and then funding his campaigns in ways that left him completely owned. Cross didn't just have a secret account. He was a wholly owned subsidiary of a foreign influence operation. Then Delaney delivered the twist that made Tessa's stomach drop. He slid a folder across the bench. Inside was a printout of an internal Citizens for Financial Integrity personnel report. Tessa's name was circled. Below it, notes from an unnamed source who had been reporting on her internship activity to the Miami firm since her second week. The source was still active. Who? Tessa whispered. Delaney pointed to a code name at the top of the file, Guard and Keeper. He didn't know the real identity, not yet, but he knew that whoever it was had been feeding information about Tessa's document requests back to the people she was investigating. That meant the senator's people didn't just suspect someone was looking into Cross. They knew who she was, where she lived, and exactly what she was finding, weeks before the charity dinner. The humiliation at the table wasn't random cruelty. It was a message. Cross had been told by his handlers that a young law student was getting too close, and he decided to put her in her place publicly in a way that would make her afraid to keep digging. He had no idea that the confrontation itself would push her over the edge, but his handlers did. Delaney believed the leak was exactly what certain factions inside the network wanted, a controlled detonation that would expose Cross, sacrifice a compromised asset, and make the rest of the network look like mere collateral damage. In the chaos, the real players would disappear deeper underground, wiping evidence as they went. Tessa put the folder down on the bench. The city was waking up now, traffic sounds drifting in from New York Avenue. She could hear her own heartbeat. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Delaney stood up. "Because I've been tracking these people for 8 years, and every time I got close, someone above me shut it down. You're outside the system, Ms. Whitfield. You're not on their payroll, and you're not afraid of them. That makes you the most dangerous person in this investigation, and it makes you the most vulnerable." He handed her a second folder, thicker than the first. "This is everything I've got. Names, accounts, dates. I'm giving it to you because there's one thing left that needs to happen before this story can end. The public needs to know the full truth, not just about one senator's greed, but about the machine that built him." Tessa looked at the folder in her hands. It felt like holding a live grenade. "And what do I do with it?" Delaney was already walking away. "You're a law student," he called back over his shoulder. "Figure out what a jury would need, and then find someone who isn't afraid to print it." Tessa walked back to the metro station in the growing light, the folder clutched against her chest. She had started this journey trying to hold one powerful man accountable. Now she was holding proof that the accountability had to go much, much higher, and that the people who'd been watching her were still inside the building. The second folder sat on Tessa's kitchen table for exactly 90 minutes before she opened it. She spent that time on the phone with Marcus Webb, packing the narrow strip of linoleum between the refrigerator and the radiator while she explained what Delaney had told her. Webb listened without interrupting. Then he said, "I'm coming over. Don't open that folder until I'm in the room. If this is what I think it is, the chain of custody needs to be airtight enough to survive a courtroom, because that's where it's going to end up." He arrived at her apartment 40 minutes later with the paper's general counsel and a forensic accountant who had been seconded from the SEC 2 years earlier. They set up a folding table in the living room, laid out the Delaney files in numbered sequence, and began the long, meticulous work of building a case that could survive cross-examination. The folder contained the FinCEN memo that had been classified and buried in 2015. It contained SWIFT records showing 63 wire transfers from a Moscow commercial bank to shell accounts in Cyprus, and from Cyprus to the Miami law firm's trust accounts. It contained a seating chart of a dinner held at a private residence in McLean, Virginia, in November 2018, with a handwritten annotation next to 3 names: committee targets. 2 of the 3 senators were still in office. One of them was now running for president. The forensic accountant, A woman named Gloria Chen, who had seen more money laundering schemes than she had birthdays, looked up from the Swift records and said something that made the room go quiet. These transfers aren't random. They match the legislative calendar. Every time the banking committee scheduled a markup on a bill that could have impacted the Moscow bank's U.S. access, a payment went through within 72 hours. She pointed at a date. This one here, a $2 million transfer, lands the day after the committee killed an amendment that would have required the Treasury to designate that bank a primary money laundering concern. The vote was 13-8. Cross voted with the majority. The math was brutal and precise. They had the paper trail that connected foreign money to specific legislative outcomes. But there was one piece still missing. The mole, the one Delaney had called Garden Keeper, was still inside Citizens for Financial Integrity, still feeding information to the Miami firm. And if Tessa moved on the newsroom story before identifying him, he would tip off the targets and the entire network would scatter. Tessa spent the next 2 days running a counter-surveillance operation from her laptop, comparing internal document request logs against the timeline of the Miami firm's responses. She noticed a pattern. Every time she had requested a specific set of records, a particular senior analyst, a man named Carl Brantley, had forwarded the request to an external email address within minutes, always to a domain that resolved to a server farm in Panama. Carl was 42, had been with Citizens for Financial Integrity for 9 years, and twice a week brought homemade banana bread to the office. He had mentored Tessa in her first month. He had told her she had real instinct for this work. On the third morning, she confronted him. She did it in the office kitchen, in front of the coffee machine, with no recording devices except the one she had hidden in her blazer pocket. "I know about Garden Keeper," she said. Carl's hand stopped mid-reach for a mug. "I know about the emails to Panama. I know about the coded billing entries." He didn't deny it. He set the mug down, looked at her with an expression that was not guilt but weariness, and said, "They pay for my daughter's medical care. She has a condition that insurance won't cover. They found me before you ever had a chance." He paused. "The Miami firm doesn't just launder money. They collect leverage on everyone." Tessa didn't report him to the authorities, not yet. She gave him a choice: testify as a cooperating witness and provide names, or be named in the article as the mole who enabled a foreign influence operation. He chose the witness list. The Ledger's second story went live 5 days later, headlined, "Moscow's Man in the Senate: How Foreign Money Bought American Policy." It named 3 senators, the Miami law firm's most senior partner, and 2 Russian nationals with ties to state intelligence. The appendices, published online, ran to 137 pages of evidence. The Department of Justice announced a special counsel investigation within 6 hours. The FBI raided the Miami law firm's offices the same afternoon, removing 42 boxes of documents and 11 servers. Carl Brantley sat in a federal conference room for 7 hours, giving testimony that would eventually lead to 18 indictments. Senator Harlan Cross was arrested at his Georgetown home on a crisp Sunday morning, charged with conspiracy to commit money laundering, honest services fraud, and perjury. The footage of him being led away in handcuffs played on every network, the same man who, just weeks earlier, had laughed off a waitress as beneath his notice. His campaign funds had been frozen, his staff had evaporated, and the donors who once toasted him at charity dinners were now issuing statements of regret and distance. His wife filed for divorce the day after the arrest. His dog was rehomed by a neighbor. Tessa watched the coverage from the kitchen of the catering company, where she had returned for one final shift. She wasn't on the schedule. She had asked to pick up the afternoon tea service because she wanted to be in that room again to close the loop. She wore the same uniform, carried the same water pitcher, and walked past the table where the senator had humiliated her. The table was empty now. She poured water for a group of nonprofit workers discussing a literacy grant, smiled, and returned to the kitchen. She hung up her apron for the last time. But what nobody in that room knew, what would not surface until the special counsel's report was released 2 years later, was that Tessa had made one more decision the night before the arrest. Delaney's folder included a single photograph of a young woman, an intern in the Miami firm who had accessed the same files Tessa had been chasing, who had never been named. The photograph was from 2014. The woman had died in a car accident that same year, officially listed as a single-vehicle collision on a rain-slicked highway. Delaney's handwritten note in the margin read, "Was getting too close. Case was closed in 48 hours." Tessa kept that photograph on her desk through law school and the bar exam and her first year as a federal prosecutor. It reminded her that the people who hide behind money and power count on the silence of ordinary people. She had not been silent, and because she had refused to be, the machine that had run Washington's backrooms for a decade was no longer running. Somewhere in a federal office building, the photograph of that intern who never got justice sits on a prosecutor's desk like a quiet question. What would have happened if someone had spoken up sooner? Tessa never set out to bring down a network. She just refused to be silent when the man who wrote the laws decided she was beneath his notice. And the one act of quiet defiance, a file uploaded from a stinking kitchen hallway, cracked open a machine no subpoena had ever touched. Truth isn't fragile. It's just waiting for someone with nothing left to lose to finally stand up and let it loose. So here's the question that matters. What have you stayed quiet about because someone told you it wasn't worth the fight? What were you told would cost too much to say out loud? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story reminded you that one person's voice can still shake the rooms that pretend to be unshakable, send it to someone who needs that reminder tonight. Because right now there's someone out there with a thumb drive in their pocket and a secret on their chest, wondering if they should open their mouth. You just watched exactly what happens when they do. If you're not subscribed yet, stay close. There's another story coming next week that I genuinely cannot wait to tell you. Until then, may you always know when to speak and when to let the truth speak for itself.